So thank you for joining us today. My name is Jenna Armitage. I'm the CMO of Tulipshare. For those of you that don't know, Tulipshare we launched in 2021, and we're a broker-dealer that focused specifically on activist investing. So what that meant was we launched campaigns at public companies to try and make them more ethical and sustainable, and solicited retail investors to start investing behind these campaigns. So think of it as like change.org meets free trade or eToro. I think some eToro people are here. But we sadly announced a couple of weeks ago that we were shutting down our broker-dealer and continuing forward with a new strategy that includes an institutional fund and a new product called Pledge Your Share that allows all retail investors or investors to globally to pledge any shares that they own on platforms like eToro or free trade or any platform that allows you to vote your shares behind campaigns that are launched by people like Tulipshare and other shareholder advocacy groups. But anyway, we're stoked to be here today and very, very excited to partner with The Conduit. We've been really hoping to host an event here, and I'm sad it's taken this long. But even more excited to be here with this group of panelists, and I'll let them introduce themselves shortly. We're going to be discussing today how and if businesses and individuals can find profitability in sustainability. And I'm going to just get started. And Sheryl, since you're on my far right, I should get better at this. I've been practicing lots of yoga these days, but still doesn't work. I'll let you kind of kick off and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation, and lovely to see you guys. I'm Sheryl Cuisia. I'm an entrepreneur, and basically people, planet, and prosperity are important to me. So my background is shareholder engagement and corporate governance advisory. Presently, we have launched the Engagement Appeal, which is basically to try to bring companies and individuals together to be constructive as opposed to activists in order to effect change. So we're trying to sign up 1 million people by December 2025. I'm so tired at the moment. And we're trying to get all the companies listed in the London Stock Exchange to commit to inclusive investor engagement. And then on the side, I run a social venture focused on houseplants, which is run out of Cambridgeshire. And I'm glad Janette is here because I'm actually also doing a doctorate in business administration focused on stakeholder capitalism. So yes, exciting times.
Thank you, Sheryl. Farah, if you want to go.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm Farah. I work for a social impact startup called Ocean Bottle. We found the collection of ocean-bound plastic through the sale of. Actually, sorry, this is not even marketing, but this is my water bottle. Through reusable bottles, and as well as digital product where we work on a B2B side to enable other businesses to collect ocean-bound plastic. And this is a for-profit startup, which I think is key for today's conversation.
Yes, it certainly is. Now, Janette?
Well, I'm at the Open University. I've been there a long time, but before that I worked in the city in M&A, and I worked as a bond analyst, and then I taught fund managers. And so I've done quite a lot of that. And in my research, I started looking at the history of investment. I got really interested because all the old books were about CEO of this company and what Barclays had done in its history. It's all about meetings between men in suits. And I thought, well, hold on a minute. Who's investing? Who were the investors in the old days? And I discovered that 100% of investors were individuals. And so there were men and women. And I gave a seminar in Cambridge once to the history department, and somebody said, we'd never thought of the gender effect. But of course, shares were fantastically appropriate for women because they wanted a regular income, they got their dividends, and as I'll talk later, they got very involved in corporate governance and the precursor to ESG.
Very, very good. I was actually quite pleased when we were practicing for this panel discussion, and Janette started bringing up the suffragettes. So very excited for you to dig into that. But let's get started. So I wanted to share an interesting fact with everybody here. COP27, their main sponsor, was the world's worst plastic polluter. So and for those of you that don't know who that is, it's Coca-Cola. To lead anything globally, good, bad, or ugly, is hard, and in Coca-Cola's case, is also very neglectful. But I'm going to throw this over to our refill reuse expert, Farah. How do you think Coca-Cola got to this point?
Well, I guess the short answer is capitalism. Then the longer answer, I guess, is we talked about it. Coca-Cola being a legacy company and really invented themselves and the business model without no consideration for obviously the environment. And today we can see it at different level from their packaging, the lack of recycling options on their products, and lack of recycling management centers in certain areas, and obviously the lobbying part of what they're really part of. I think I remember in 2018 where they strongly lobbying against the UK government against some sort of bills towards reducing plastic pollution. That's the short answer. Medium answer.
Medium answer, which is great. Well, not great, but I think what I then found to be most astonishing being at Tulipshare was that, in the last, so they've been the worst plastic polluter for the last 5 years, but they've not had a single shareholder proposal on their ballot around plastic pollution. Everybody seems to know about it. The press was talking about it around COP27, but it still continued to progressively get worse and worse, or was able to be maintained. And for those that don't know, just kind of giving some background, a proxy, so that's when a public company will release statements to shareholders whenever they need to start to solicit votes from investors. And so shareholders, individuals or large, can submit proposals, particularly in the US, if you meet specific criteria. And no investors have stepped forward. It's something that you'd think when there is such a big reputational risk, they would. So Sheryl, I'm gonna, sorry, didn't mean to startle you, pop this one over to you and see, not only around kind of the shareholder activism side, but what holds companies back from prioritizing sustainability?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of reasons, and I've listed 10 here, but won't go through that. And ultimately, I think the reasons are the main reason is highly rooted in the competing theory of stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder primacy. And so I think a lot of companies are still very focused on short-term shareholder returns. So what we're doing at the engagement appeal is trying to get more intergenerational interaction into companies, because our view is that Gen Zs and millennials maybe are more attuned to social and environmental concerns. And so by having companies look at not just financial return, they then will be encouraged to actually incorporate sustainability into their strategy. And then I think maybe lack of awareness, the cost, the initial outlay that is necessary to actually become sustainable is sometimes off-putting for companies. And we've found that in our work in my previous company called Boudica, where CFOs would want to become greener, but then the cost associated to that, and then articulating it to the shareholders was a hindrance. And then I'm sure the others will also have views on this, but competitiveness, maybe regulatory barriers, and then also the culture of the organization could be barriers to becoming greener.
Yeah. Can I add something?
Yes.
That is very, very true. And I think another challenge here is the complexity of what sustainability means. It's not as straightforward, and obviously there's some right towards what businesses can do, but often there will be a lack of technical knowledge and skills, even at the most at a very deep level. And I think that's another layer of challenge here.
The other thing is their shareholders. They don't really know who their shareholders are anymore. So how can you make decisions when you don't know who you're doing it for?
Yeah, I love this woman. It's absolutely true. So basically, what we're fighting for again at the engagement appeal is diversifying companies' engagement, because historically, what's been happening to date is that companies tend to just engage with their top 10, top 20 largest investors. And guess what? Those tend to be the large asset managers, right? But who is behind the asset managers? Us, right? Who's behind the pension funds? Us. So basically, there needs to be a better system of identifying those shareholders and then including them in the process. But companies are afraid that they will open up the floodgates if they actually solicit these votes. The term solicit sounds funny, but basically if they actively, take in the opinion. But our view is actually we need the diverse thinking, because you don't want to end up like Kodak. You don't want to end up like BlackBerry. You want to be future-proofed, and to do that, you have to engage. You have to know your shareholders.
Now, I think this kind of goes straight into that, but if a company's not prioritizing, do you feel that shareholders are responsible, or who do you think is the responsible party to raise some of these issues?
Well, the shareholders have a forum, which is the annual general meeting. The shareholders have a forum, which is the annual general meeting, so they have the ability, even if they only have one share, to go and stand and ask a question. The problem is the US and the UK are very different, and the UK, you have the right to all sorts of things. You can just stand up and say, I vote that we have a resolution on X, and that we start a shareholder committee to investigate something, and you can just do that, and you only need 10% of the vote. I know it's a lot if you don't know who the shareholders are, but it's not. It's better than 50. And you get 10% to have an extraordinary general meeting, which gives you an amazing amount of publicity. And again, in the UK, you can do that on any topic, whereas in the US, you're limited. You have to do it in advance. You can't have any spontaneous things in the meeting. So it's much harder in the US, and I think it's frightening, because UK companies are now more and more held by US fund managers who are operating under a different corporate governance regime.
Yeah, can I add? So, firstly, my accent is not American; it's Canadian, just to clarify. But I think to the point about who's responsible for, correcting wrongs and affecting change. Well, stakeholders in general, right? So, absolutely, completely agree. Shareholders, stand up and make your voices heard. I think government also has a big say. Employees who work for companies who are polluting and not contributing to society, they have a massive responsibility. The media, and then organizations, NGOs, organizations like Tulipshare, the Engagement Appeal, we all have a part in this, and it is very suffragette to basically, bitches, stand up. If you don't like something, create the change that you want to see. And in the world that we live in today, our singular voices actually can be heard much more than before. So I think we need to use that platform. I'm sure you have views around this as well, right?
Yeah. I guess the way we do it at Ocean Bottle, and again, it's a startup, is we in addition to the classic board, we also have impact science-based board, basically, where we work with different experts in the sustainability field to not only engage, like you said, help us with this engagement piece, but also on the technical aspect, but also to make us accountable. And I guess, depending on what type of business you are, but consumers, and you touched on that as well, but if you are D2C company with a strong community, they will take you accountable. And I guess it doesn't mean being perfect, but I guess it's just not talking shit when something wrong happens, because from the moment you create a product, from the moment any single human being on that planet, we have a sustainable. We're not sustainable. We have, an impact. But I guess is how do we minimize that, and how are we transparent? How do we drive transparency? That would be my experience.
Amazing. And now, I'm Farah, you're because Ocean Bottle obviously has found profitability in sustainability, but what can a company, what are the stages, or how long do you think it would take a company like Coca-Cola to start to turn things around? Should investors of Coca-Cola see that actually you can find profitability and sustainability, you can flip things around? And Janette, I know you probably have some really good things to share too around what fund managers should be thinking.
The problem with fund managers is, when I was a pension fund trustee, we wanted to buy funds that were ethical. But then your remit says you've got to maximise profit for the shareholders. So it's quite tricky. They come back to you and they say, well, we can't do that.
Yeah.
Or else you take out insurance to not be sued by somebody who says, I wanted a maximum profit. And then you need to change it. If everybody did it, you'd need, everybody became, if people didn't become sustainable, then people wouldn't invest in their shares. And, what would happen is, for example, with oil, you've got, suppose I decide that I'm going to carry on making oil and people don't want to buy my shares. So the share price goes down, I have less money, the bank won't lend me money, there's less oil in the world. What happens to the third world, the developing countries? What do they live on? Because the oil price is going to go up. Mm-hmm. So you have problems that, should you do it at the corporate level or at the government level?
Yeah.
Or at the international government level?
I'm not smart enough to answer this question, but it is true. There's so much. It's quite complex when you come to these types of decisions, and what is the right one to make when you start to get faced with whether or not you should invest, divest, only invest in ethical, etc. But going back to Coca-Cola's example, what is the cost of sustainability? How do you start to pivot to become sustainable, and start to build that path to different stakeholders or folks that are, that you're reporting into?
Yeah. So it is a long journey, that's for sure. There is no cut corner approach, unfortunately. I think the second bad news from a pure profit aspect is, yes, the immediate impact on the P&L will be seen on both top line and probably bottom line. But as we've said, on the long run, those will be the companies that will remain competitive and develop a USP. So I guess this is exactly what you said about the short-term and long-term approach.
Exactly. So it's kind of similar to diversity and inclusion, right? So the whole campaign around even gender diversity to begin with, which seems quite old now. But basically, the statistics are now very clear that, companies that are diverse and inclusive are better performing. And then again, to that future-proofing perspective about why should you become more sustainable as a company? Well, if you don't, you will die, right? You will not exist in the world that is coming. So literally, again, it's that point about sincerity on diversity, equitability, and inclusion, engaging with the investors, soliciting different views that might be uncomfortable to you as a company, as a board, and then building the strategy and putting in the investment and getting the shareholder support and explaining to shareholders that actually this is a long-term investment into our success as a collective. And then basically also thinking about my guy crush, Professor Oliver Hart. He's from Harvard University, originally from King's College in Cambridge. But basically, he talks about shareholders not always wanting maximized profit, that some of them are actually interested in investing in companies that will do good for society and the planet. or maybe where they get perks. Like, I think your mother-in-law invests in whiskey because she gets free whiskey. So,
Sorry, Pippa.
so companies, I like those Pippa.
That was a big thing in the 60s and 70s, was shareholder perks.
Yes.
You used to get free tickets on the ferry and chocolate boxes and all sorts of things. There's a book just come out by Amy Edwards which actually talks about that.
Yeah, no, what's so funny is because I tend to...
It's not just whiskey, too. It's chocolate.
The funny thing is, so I always talk about Gen Zs, millennials, all these different groups, and it's not to be like, oh my God, ageist or anything, although the best generation is probably Gen X. But basically, the funny thing is, because there seems to be this huge difference between the baby boomers and the Gen Zs and millennials, they're not that different. So what you're talking about, perks, guess what? Gen Zs and millennials love perks, right? And I guess, you know...
I'm more of a points person, but I guess there's perks attached to that.
So I guess the point about intergenerational collab is so important in all of this.
Yeah, it is very true. I mean, it takes a village to try and drive some of this change, so...
Yeah, absolutely. And, also we can all agree on that. There will always be some, tension and reminders on a daily basis when you run a business because, and not on the Coca-Cola example, but if you're a startup, there will be cases where you will be torn. Okay, do I really want to partner with that? Are you okay?
Your talk is
Not
so...
sustainable.
That was actually a party trick. It was all part of the plan.
Okay.
Are you okay?
Yeah. You okay?
You're okay. Yeah.
Her lawyers are coming.
It wasn't sustainable.
Oh my God. So you will be torn because obviously on one side you have that P&L pressure, not necessarily to please shareholders. Also, yes, we agree. But if you're a startup, you also have your cash run rate to look at. And a very good example of that Ocean Bottle. Often we will have potential businesses reaching out to us to work with us, and there wouldn't be the best partners to look at is from a sustainability angle. But then, when you face, for example, a potential big deal with the FIFA, during the World Cup, and we're talking about a huge big deal that would make a big difference on our run away, what do? And these are the daily decisions you have to make. Also, sustainability is at your core, is embedded within your business model. And yes, 15% of your top line revenue is dedicated to plastic partners on the ground around the world. And yes, I mean, even on the team, we haven't talked about employees' engagement as well, but everyone is very passionate about this. But then when the reality hits, those are the daily challenges that a business, for-profit, has to face. So it is challenging, of course, and this is how I guess you go back to your values and how you want to move forward to reach that long-term goal.
Totally. Janette, this one is for you. So when most people think of ESG investing, they think of investing in good companies, so sustainable companies, people like Ocean Bottle. But what happens, and divesting from companies that are doing bad, so thinking of oil, tobacco, alcohol, I don't know why that's considered bad, but but what happens to companies who are unsustainable if we were all to adopt this approach to our investment strategies?
Well, I think, as I said, it would make the share price go down. But
yeah,
you've got a global problem. If nobody is producing oil at all, you need oil. You've got to do the infrastructure spending at the same time.
Yeah.
You've got to do both at once. And so we can all switch to investing in sustainable. Sorry. It's because I'm having to turn round. I'm just saying that, you need to do the infrastructure spending at the same time. And the obvious way to do it is to get tax relief from the government, to not invest in unsustainable, but to invest in sustainable. So there's a government role to play, like the Biden package.
Got it. So, it's not just, it shouldn't just be, the private markets doing it on its own. It needs to be, it takes a village.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like the windfall tax in the UK, where the government actually gave tax relief to people looking for oil, as people got it slightly wrong. But that was what they were, they were doing, was biasing the investment.
So can I add a few
Please.
things there? So I'm going to reference my guy crush again, Professor Oliver Hart. So he and another academic called Luigi Zingales wrote a great paper in 2017 about engagement versus divestment. So myself being an advocate of engagement, I prefer to actually stick with companies and try to engage.
Yeah.
Because I feel that I could have better influence that way. So understanding that change doesn't happen immediately.
Yeah.
So I prefer to stay and, converse constructively. And then in terms of what these two guys have said, Professor Oliver Hart and Luigi, basically when you're thinking about engagement or divestment, sorry, I'm so tired, I wrote things down here, you need to look at a few things. So one is the probability of success. So if you do decide to engage, okay, what is the probability of you succeeding with your engagement? Then the next thing is looking at the time horizon, because the engagement might take longer than what you can sustain for your long-term process. The resources required, so engagement does require people. And then, if you divest, I guess a positive from that is you're signaling, there's a signaling effect that you disapprove. And then another is for engagement, which is the potential for collaboration. So I guess based on this, Luigi and Oliver are saying engage rather than divest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big fan of engaging. I think that, you have a lot more power when you stay than when you go. Although, Janette, you can tell me off. Go on.
No, I think that's right. And I think, I was going to talk about these stakeholder committees, these shareholder committees that used to happen on a regular basis. What you want is to have some kind of forum where you're engaging with the company all the time to keep them on their toes. And so you're constantly raising issues. So go back to the railway companies in the 19th century. They had shareholder committees. They used to go and see the managers with lists of problems that they had to solve, and it worked very well. It's just we've let people get away with murder by not doing this engagement. So I think it's brilliant what you're doing.
Thank you. So can I ask you guys a question?
Please.
Then, right? So like with the war in Ukraine, and it's, sad. There were a lot of people who divested from like arms businesses. Mm-hmm. What do we think about that? So basically, I guess your question, Jenna, earlier was if everyone divested from these companies,
Yeah.
what would happen? Because we still need. So would you invest in arms businesses? Would you invest in tobacco?
I really regret allowing you to ask a question. Personally, that isn't the top of my list. I probably choose, and I can't provide any investing advice. But on a personal level, I kind of think about, okay, I like this, like Airbnb, love Airbnb. And, I don't get any perks from it. I should really, try and put a shareholder proposal around that. I follow the companies that I like as a consumer and kind of invest that way. Don't know that that's necessarily the right way to do things, and I'm not, kind of thinking about what's happening in a geopolitical landscape. But I can imagine that actually investing in arms is something that, Ukraine needs to defend its country. they're going to need arms, but
I guess it's about finding the sweet spot, right? At the moment, unfortunately, there are way more harmful businesses on that planet that not harmful. So if we were able to, rebalance, that would be maybe a nice problem to have. It's about changing quickly because the clock is ticking, really.
Yeah. I'm going to move on from, unless Janette, did you have something to add there? Another challenge that exists today is the inability to measure sustainability on a global scale. I've been meeting with a lot of, a good handful of public companies these days who are talking a lot around how ESG reports are taking up the majority of their time and actually pulling them away from actually driving results. They're focused on creating these reports that often most people aren't even paying attention to. How can we ensure, but as individuals, we do care about these things, and I think a lot of us, I can say personally, I stopped believing some of the numbers that I get in ESG reports because, I'm a consumer of the product and I know that it's not there yet. So how can we ensure as individuals that a company's sustainability goals are genuine and not just profiting off a change in culture?
With difficulty.
With difficulty, that is true.
It was the same with, ethical funds. I remember when we were doing a beauty parade for an ethical fund for this pension fund I was involved in. These two ethical funds came in, and one of them said that they didn't buy Tesco because it didn't have catalytic converters on its lorries, and the other one said it was ethical because of some other reason. So, people were disagreeing about whether companies were sustainable or not. Really.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And there's lots of money to be made in organising all that and creating lots of numbers to analyse and produce, but what do they mean?
Yeah. Farah, I know you guys have lots of reports.
It's 100% relevant. That's the biggest challenge, and we talked about it earlier. The technical sustainability is so complex, and even sustainability experts would sometimes disagree, but then in the just general business space, I'm sure if I ask people, well, maybe we can ask people, if you have the choice at the supermarket to pick up a plastic bag or a paper bag, which one do you choose? Paper bag, plastic bag, put your hands up.
That's impressive.
Brave.
Plastic bag, only 2 people, okay, cool. And the rest, you will pick up the paper bag.
I would choose no bag.
Depends how many wine bottles you've got in it.
Yeah, wine, we're packaging wine, people.
Well, obviously, from a pure plastic pollution aspect, yes, that's not great. But guess what? From a sustainability aspect, the plastic bag is more sustainable than your paper bag. Nobody knows that because everything is so complex, everything... Yes, but then exactly that. And then you would want to look at it in a holistic way. You wouldn't want... We've talked about Coca-Cola and the plastic pollution, but then sustainability is more than that. We don't talk about, for example, the carbon. And obviously this is the biggest... This is the elephant in the room, because if you compare, our current CO2 emission compared to our plastic pollution, we have... One is way bigger than the other one, not saying the other one is not as important. Right? So from, for example, a CO2 point of view, your paper bag is not as great as your plastic one. And it's the same with, for example, jar. In the cosmetic industry, a lot of companies moved from, plastic packaging to glass ones.
Yeah.
Which is another disaster because from carbon footprint, it does increase it. I think it's something like 18 times. So going back to your point, yes, it's not easy. Yes, nobody has, we don't know. And I guess the solution here is to keep working with peers, working with different peers and building this community and engage to share best practices, even, amongst different businesses. And just going back on this SDG report or the ones that businesses will do, for example, annual impact reports. I don't know if a lot of our customers read that, but what I do know is that it makes also us accountable and it helps our teams internally to keep learning, challenging, and trying to drive better ways, really.
I would agree on that point about reporting, absolutely. However, overall, I'm just going to have a mini whinge. The annual reports of today are not fit for purpose. I'm ADHD and I have the attention span of a fungus gnat. So basically, reading 250 pages of reporting does not suit me. And I think it would not suit others as well. And then also it leads companies to be obsessed about reporting as opposed to making impact. So we need to shift that mindset a bit, and this is where, again, the engagement is helpful because we can actually help companies give us what we want, right? And then in terms of just a very basic tactic I use when I meet with chairs and CEOs of listed companies, particularly the chairs, so I like to have fun with them. So I ask them, Mr. Chair,
Or Mrs.
or Madame, yes, exactly. To whom should the company be accountable? Shareholders or stakeholders? And this is really interesting, the responses. So the majority of the time, what do you think they say? So for those who think shareholders, raise your hands. So stakeholders meaning the wider customers, employees, etc. So who said shareholders? Okay. And who said stakeholders? Okay. So it's actually 50-50. So statutorily, companies are liable to their shareholders. That's who they're responsible to, right? However, the right mentality, and actually you mentioned Tesco, they have told me, and it's in their annual reports, that they are accountable to their stakeholders, because if they're accountable to their stakeholders, then they would perform better for their shareholders. So I think that's an easy test. So whenever you see like a spare FTSE 100 share walking around, just grab them and say, oh.
It gets on to, there are some companies who are a natural customer shareholder type thing. So Tesco's is viewing all its customers as potential shareholders and vice versa.
Yes.
So it's much easier than when you're a coal mine in somewhere, Utah or something.
Absolutely.
And you can become a shareholder if you are a stakeholder by just buying one share. So in a sense, they're interchangeable.
You know what? Like a dream of mine was to buy shares in every single listed company, but like as a registered shareholder, so that in my retirement, I would attend AGMs every day. But then what's happening is that actually like AGMs are becoming like less foodie and like less perky. So then I'm like, okay, maybe I'll just pivot a little bit and just invest in like buy one share in like the ones that have the best AGM. So if anyone wants to...
Can I tell you, there's a long history of slightly odd women doing exactly that.
Thanks, Janette. I should join that club.
Wait, Janette, go on.
No, I mean, they're called gadflies. And so there was a woman called Wilma Sauce. So she used to come to the AGM, and if they'd cut the dividend, she would wear black. And once she came in a 19th century bathing costume. This was in the 1950s. And she wore it to show that their techniques were out of date. And then there was this woman called Eleanor Davis, who was at about the same time, and she was mad as a hatter. So she was done for prostituting and soliciting people.
Oh my God.
And she actually sort of had fights with Wilma Sauce at the AGMs. And you know, you can, whereas in England, we had this woman who I'm writing a book about, who was just absolutely amazing. The FT wrote eulogising articles about her. She went to the AGM, she knew more than the men, and she was sarcastic. So she says things like, if I couldn't have made the balance sheet more opaque if I'd tried. So she was just brilliant. I've discovered that she had, looking at the FT, that she had 38 shareholdings in different companies over a period, and that was over a period of 25 years.
Oh my goodness.
She was on 4 shareholder committees. She became the chairman of Slater's, which was the biggest restaurant company. And she did everything. She was talking about the dividends versus the reserves. You know, she would tell people off for paying too big a dividend, saying it wasn't sustainable. You know, she was ahead of the game. They were fighting for equal income tax rights for women. She was a suffragette. She talked about being a suffragette in AGM. Yeah. She was totally astonishing, but she wasn't as mad as these Americans were.
Oh my God.
And it was all women. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is very. I love that. And you actually just teed me up for our next question. So one of my favorite points about chatting with you was your knowledge of all the history of shareholder activism. And so, you know, with that, can you share an example of when shareholders have either banded together, pulled together, and drove change? Maybe it's sustainable change. That would be great. But, you know, any cool stories that you can share with the audience just around what do you need?
There were some major ones that were quite... Because basically I worked out there were something like 600 attempts at this over a period of 40 years. So, that, you know, it wasn't a huge number every year. But you've got to remember, in those days, London was a very small place. All the AGMs were here, all the lawyers were here, the accountants were here, the chairmen were here. So if you were humiliated by the shareholders in a meeting at your AGM, everybody knew about it. And your gentleman's club, you know, it can't have been a pleasant place to go. So you could cause quite a lot of upset quite easily. And so the companies that you'll know that were involved, for example, Dunlop had a problem with their executive remuneration. Sorry, so I'm wrong. Schweppes they got rid of the board because they were misinvesting and they didn't like their strategy. And several, they stepped in when they thought that the company was unsustainable and they needed to steady it. So they forced them to reinvest and things. So Waring and Gillow, for example, which was a furniture company, they saved from liquidation. There's quite a few examples. And there were women who stood up in AGMs and said, I don't want you to raise the dividend, because if you raise the dividend, I'll worry that you're going to cut the dividend. So please keep it stable. So if you can't call that sustainability, I don't know what you can.
Amazing. Last question for you all, and that is, you know, the fact that one of the key things that we've talked about is transparency and communication between companies, its stakeholders, and or the lack thereof. And it's been quite a theme in shareholder activism and in that world. So I think we can all agree that communication is key amongst companies and all of its shareholders or stakeholders. So a question for you, just to kind of leave us here, is what's one way this can be addressed, and how can companies use its shareholders to start to drive growth and sustainable growth?
So I think overall there's a need for a mindset shift from what we know to basically what makes us feel slightly uncomfortable. And part of that is actually basically learning from one another. So again, I'm very much focused nowadays on constructivism after 20 years of doing very aggressive activism. So my previous company was called Boudica, right? So we weren't shy and retiring. And we did do a lot of good work through activism. But basically now what we're finding is probably going to be more helpful is, again, increased collaboration. And that collaboration will help with the learning and then the issues around transparency and identifying shareholders, etc. So
I think education might be useful because we just discovered that we don't know what's sustainable and isn't.
100%.
And a few MOOCs or somebody funding some education so that we have some benchmarks and some norms that we know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
That would help then dialogue because I might be talking to you about and completely misunderstanding what you mean by sustainable. And as I was at the Open University for a long time, we're perfectly well placed to do that.
And then maybe another point would be around technology.
Yeah.
So in terms of the work that we're doing on opening up engagement, companies are afraid that increased inclusive investor engagement is going to be expensive and laborious. Actually, no. With increased technology that already exists, it doesn't have to cost the earth. Literally. So basically, it's this combination of like shifting our mindsets. Let's be open to new things, right?
Yeah.
Let's not be entitled. Let's learn from younger people. Let's learn from other generations. And then the togetherness is really important. And then technology, I guess more carrot for now, but then if they don't eat the carrot, then you bring out the stick and the whip. Right?
I very much look forward to seeing you at AGMs in your 70s.
Tomorrow, it's AGM season. Who's going to the AGM tomorrow?
Farah, what about you?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think this mindset shift is really needed, and there is also the willingness. I mean, we all here because we're interested in, at least in sustainability, but there's a big portion of people on the planet that don't. And I guess is how do we get some buy-in from these people to create a bigger wave? And I guess, like everybody said now, is just bringing all the stakeholders together and through transparency, because businesses can be transparent, acknowledging mistakes, saying they don't know if, plastic bag and is better, or paper bag or jar or whatever. But I guess is having that integrity and doing business is absolutely necessary, but it won't happen if there is no willingness or any shift in terms of mindset. Yeah.
Awesome. Communication, education, and transparency. I think that's easy. Yeah. So I'm going to open it up to everybody here for any questions. Just raise your hand and Lizzie will hand you the microphone, or Christine.
Hello. I was going to ask, is the question really about incentives? Whilst management teams are remunerated and bonuses are on share price returns, how can their incentive be to be more sustainable?
Sheryl?
Yeah, that's a good question, because CEO targets, management targets tend to be, as you said, based on traditional performance metrics, right? But if we look at Boohoo, for example, which is one of, oh my God, is anyone here from Boohoo? I've bought stuff from Boohoo. I looked so slutty. I loved it. But basically, so they have the NatWest head of sustainability join their board as one of the two females, and she's been championing ESG and actually succeeded in adding to the long-term incentive plan the criteria of ESG performance. So that's great. So I think what could be interesting for this group is continuously lobbying listed companies to include ESG sustainability metrics in incentives.
I think that's an excellent idea because it's not regulated. You don't have to worry about rewriting the contracts and things too much. So I think that's an excellent idea.
Awesome.
We've got one over here.
Are you judged on your COO, right? So obviously, okay, stupid question, but obviously you would have metrics in your contract around responsibility, sustainability.
Yeah, and I guess it's easier for a business like ours because impact and sustainability is already embedded in what we do. But yeah, our North Star is the number of kilos of ocean-bound plastic collected every year and to date. So you mentioned Boohoo. Of course, in situation like that, again, and it's not about creating groups, but there is so much you can do with shareholders and customers of such businesses, right? And I guess it's trying to focus on what we can influence a bit more and hoping that the wave will get bigger and bigger. I keep saying that, coming back from a surf trip, I guess, but that is that. And yes, if we look at the only financial aspect of it, of course, it's very difficult. But then if you look at B Corp, that really measure the performance of a business on their profit, people, and planet contributions, then that's more interesting work to do, I guess.
Amazing.
We've got a question over here.
Oh, thank you. Sonio Jagger here. So I quite enjoyed your discussion, very much enlightening. I think sustainability has to be addressed from a global perspective. And one of my questions is, you mentioned one of the biggest issues around the world right now is the inability to measure sustainability at the global stage. So conversely, what we know is that we know the biggest carbon, emissions. We know where the carbon emission comes from. For example, we can measure the carbon emission. If we talk, for example, about Africa, which is 54 countries, they only account for only 3.8%. I don't even want to talk about the US, you do the math. So, so now, and you also mentioned COP 2027. So one of the core issues, very core recurring issues at the COP that always ended all the COP since COP 23 in limbo is the fundamental divide between the global West and the global South. Global West means Africa, Latin America, all the developing countries, and the global West meaning developed countries. So the fundamental issue being, why should we refrain from using fossil fuel and fossil energy to develop our countries and just stick to the rules coming from the West? So this is a fundamental divide that is dividing the entire global society, and so my question is, how do you address that issue? No matter all the effort we do here, how do you, because this has to be addressed from a global perspective. Thank you.
Janette, we agreed before this that you were going to take all the hard questions.
No, well, I've already raised this point. Why should they pay for the higher oil prices for us feeling good about doing something with wind over here? So you're quite right. The only way I can see is some kind of package like the Biden package, or other countries just paying transfer of money to people for whose fault it was not and can no longer afford to live. So it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, absolutely. I have nothing to add to that. But I guess when you mention it has to be done at a global phase, yes, for sure. But I don't think it's one or the other. I think even at individual level, if we all make an effort, and it's not about perfection, but it's about controversial eating maybe a bit less meat, or taking your tote bag to the store that you can still carry your wine with it. So yeah, it has to come from different angles. And the global one that you just mentioned is, I'm out of my depth on that. It's not something I deal with D2C consumers, everyday sort of stuff. What you're talking about is definitely a big, big challenge that has to be looked at a global level and led by governments, and as opposed to consumers, because it's just a bit beyond what our everyday life, I guess.
Thank you. It's actually just to follow on from that gentleman's question. I think if you think about all the people that can exact change or enact change around sustainability, consumers, really, really hard to do. God, do I use a plastic bag or a paper bag? Apparently the paper bag's worse. I don't really know. And actually, me as an individual, I'm one of the very small percentage of people that have the luxury to financially make decisions that have a positive sustainability impact. The vast, vast majority of people globally, and even in the UK, don't have that luxury. So consumers are kind of out. Companies, we've talked about how actually, as much as we want to push and engage with sustainability in companies, the reality is that they're there for shareholder returns, and actually it takes a long time to realise the positive shareholder return benefit from sustainable decisions you're making today. So challenging also for companies to enact change. Following on from the gentleman's question, it sounds like governments need to be doing more because they're people that can really have an impact here. We talked about the Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, but it's here in the UK, we don't hear very much governmental rhetoric around how we're increasing sustainability. I'm just wondering if anyone has any thoughts on what we can be doing here today from the government lobbying for change.
Okay, so I'm probably not the best person to answer that because I believe in people-powered movements and not always relying on government. So our view, again, at the engagement appeal is that you need wholesale market participation to actually affect the change that we need. So that means it's companies working with shareholders, including the individual investors, working with the intermediaries, working with advisors, and working with the different organizations. And in approaching it in this way, where it's like people-powered movement backed by big business and powered also by tech, then governments will stand up and realize actually, okay, we need to do more. So this country, and again, being Canadian, living here for 20 years, has actually done quite well doing things voluntarily. So it's not as broad as ESG at all, but diversity, gender diversity, we were able to meet the target of 30% females on boards without having to have like legislation. And so basically, I think start off with voluntary, and then if that doesn't work, then
Can
push
I
harder.
make a point that diversity doesn't cost very much to introduce, whereas what we're talking about costs zillions. And I think we should use the water industry as a stepping stone here, because they've done everything wrong. You know, they've given themselves billions in dividends. You know, they haven't invested, they haven't been sustainable, they've been lightly regulated, and they'd rather pay the fines. I mean, I saw that in the city when I was doing expert witness work, that firms would be charged fines for mis-selling, and they'd do it anyway because they made more money mis-selling than they paid in fines. And this is the way the water companies, and I think the water companies offer a fantastic opportunity because it's across the entire nation, it's not political, it's all people, and I think we should just go on the streets for raise awareness that way, because it's a fantastic case study of what can go horribly wrong.
Any other questions?
Is this something we just have to accept that we're going to have to pay for? Because you talk about the water companies. I think Thames Water says it's going to cost them $32 billion to fix the mess they've made.
Yeah, I think it's going to have to be national.
Yeah.
Is it just something that we all have to accept that? Yeah, I mean, fine.
I think so. I mean, then I guess the real question is obviously who has to pay for that. But yeah, the answer is yes. And again, going back to what I know best, the D2C industry. And if you look at fashion, yes, for decades we were used to pay a Primark T-shirt for £2, but the hit has to be taken along the supply chain. So yeah, if you want to be sustainable, you cannot pay your shirt £2. So yeah, the answer is yes. Really, I guess is then how can we make sure that the right people are paying?
Yeah.
And I think also just the education bit and empowering people and individuals to start to stand up as they start to see things going wrong and hold people accountable earlier on. probably is going to be something that we need to think about more long term, because obviously water is a resource that we cannot live without. So I think it's a good example.
Because the French don't need AGMs, they just need streets.
Well, I thought the example of the plastic versus paper bag thing was very interesting. But like, is there a source of information that you could direct people to answer some of those types of questions? Like, personally, I use like one of those reusable ones. I've used like 100, 200 times. But, if I were to have that sort of choice, how would I know?
That's a very good point, and I think, like you mentioned, is she rightfully challenged me on saying, but it depends on how we define sustainability. At Ocean Bottle, we look at plastic pollution, and the reason why I asked that question is because, to me, sustainability is what costs the most to the planet, which today is the carbon emission. Having a true source of information where you can find this, I don't know it. I know that it comes from multiple sources that are sometimes very complicated to follow, and also because that's my job. But for everyday consumerism life, I feel like she has an answer.
Are there any type marks or anything that we can look for? I know people are looking at putting carbon footprints on food and stuff like that, but if you don't have like hours and hours to do this stuff, what are you supposed to do?
There's a gap in the market as well.
Thank you. No, I don't have an easy answer. As go to this website. Actually, sustainability is about resolving complex problems. Complex problems don't have one answer or solution. So, yeah, it's very nice your question about plastic bag and paper bag, because the answer to that is it depends. It depends where did you cut the trees to make that paper bag. It depends on where the plastic come from. What do we should prioritize? Plastic or carbon? I would say it depends. So we have found microplastic on placenta, on blood. So what is worse? Biodiversity also affected by both. So I think if we aim to resolve the challenges, the environmental challenges that we have now with simple questions like, and your question is great, I'm not saying that there is not a very fair and very challenging one, but I don't think that's the mindset. I think the mindset needs to be about interrogating everything we do from a business point of view and from an individual point of view with every cent of vote.
Which again is, we appreciate it's a luxury to have if you're in that mindset as a human being. So sorry, can't answer that question.
But I would entirely agree with the whole questioning point, because you're right. There isn't that one app. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm always looking at things like this, right? So I know at least 2 people who are trying to build ESG apps for consumers to help them make better buying decisions. And I think down the line that will happen. But even like buying plants, I have 1,000 plants in my farmhouse in North Cambridgeshire, so I love houseplants. And you'd think that, oh my God, that is so cool, ecological to have houseplants. Well, actually, some of those plants came from Indonesia, Thailand. A lot of the commercial houseplants that we buy, they come from the Netherlands. And then they are grown in greenhouses that then are powered by energy. And then it's got plastic and some peat in the soil. So you have to ask the questions. And if you're uncomfortable by the answers, don't buy it. Yeah? And if you want some plants, I can just give you some cuttings.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we can wrap up. I saw a hand over here.
I think someone else is actually before me. Are you sure? I actually was just going to pick up on that point, because it's really interesting that the answer is that it's way more complex, but then the discussion earlier was about ESG reporting and how it's too complex. And so I kind of sit in this space of how do we put across simple messages, but with also understanding that there's a trade-off and implication to it, because as businesses, you're right, we want to simplify and we want to cut down and we want to, make our message really clear, but it's a challenge. So.
You could argue that companies should get on with it on a sort of sector basis, or on the CBI, if it has nothing else to do, could look at that kind of thing. Yeah, so to agree at the corporate level what companies are going to produce.
I'm going to make an attempt. So for me, again, the reporting is not suitable, and companies spend so much money actually they spend about $150,000, or like Archie Norman was talking about this. I don't completely agree with like 100% digital AGMs, by the way. I think hybrid is the best. I don't know if you've been following this Marks and Spencer chair thing, because I would like to have a biscuit if I go to an AGM. But basically, in terms of the whole reporting process, I think actually companies should work with their shareholders more, particularly with the individuals, and say, hey, what exactly do you want to know from us? And there's also things like TCFD, there's all these Sustainalytics, all these different rating type agencies and metrics. And I think just we need to spend that time to reform the whole reporting process. So then it's more efficient, it's more usable, and then we have more time actually making impact. But like there's no quick answer. So like E, I think, is better off. I'm very S, and that is much more subjective. And so then how do you measure it? So it's a live, breathing thing, and we're writing the rules, I guess. So
amazing. And I think that's all we have for now. But we'll have some time. We have some canapes and drinks that are all free to enjoy.
Jenna, just sorry. Can we have one more?
Sorry.
Sorry, just I don't mean to speak much. Just one sentence suggestion. You guys are doing an amazing job. I would love you guys to start a campaign against water, just ordinary water, being traded in the Wall Street Stock Exchange. Actually, water joined oil in 2020. So you can imagine water being traded on the US Wall Street Stock Exchange. What it means is that you have big multinationals that go all around the world wherever there's water, and then they buy, they privatize it. So how do we achieve sustainability? Please start that campaign. I know you can do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for believing in us.
It's interesting because you can't have futures in coal, apparently, because of ESG reasons. The NYSE doesn't do that. So it's interesting that you can do water.
Well, I'm about to turn water into wine, so everybody can enjoy. Everybody can enjoy some canapes before they go cold, and everybody from the panel will be around, so you can continue this conversation a bit more direct. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody.